The silence of the hospital room was a living thing, a thick, humming presence, punctuated by the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator and the placid beep of the heart monitor. To the world, Liam Archer was a statue carved from flesh, a man trapped in the waxy stillness of a coma. His eyes, occasionally open, stared blankly at the acoustic tiled ceiling, seeing nothing. His body, once lean and strong from years of clambering over construction sites, was now a dead weight upon the crisp, sterile sheets. They saw a vessel, an absence. They were wrong. Inside the silent prison of his own body, Liam was furiously, terrifyingly alive. He was a ghost in his own machine, his mind a pristine, brightly lit room with no doors and no windows. He could hear everything: the condescendingly gentle nurses, the hushed, grave pronouncements of the doctors, the rustle of his wife Clara's dress as she paced by his bedside. He felt the phantom itch on his nose he couldn't scratch, the growing ache in his back from the unyielding mattress, the terrifying inability to command his own lungs to draw a breath. It had been 3 weeks since the stroke, a sudden, searing thunderclap in his brain that had felled him in the middle of his own kitchen. 3 weeks of this waking nightmare. He had learned to measure time by the changing shifts of the nurses and the angle of the sun slanting through the blinds. He had learned the terrifying geography of his own helplessness. But tonight he would learn the true, abysmal depth of his situation. Clara was not alone. Her father, Richard Preston, had joined her. Liam could smell the cloying scent of Richard's expensive, obnoxious cologne, a scent he had always associated with condescension and unsolicited financial advice. "He just lies there." Clara's voice was a carefully constructed whisper, laced with a fatigue that sounded almost genuine. "The doctors, they don't know. They use words like persistent vegetative state. There's no change, Daddy." Richard made a low, sympathetic noise. "It's a tragedy, my dear. A complete tragedy. But you must be strong. You must think about the future." There was a pause, filled only by the beeping of the monitor that was charting the steady, unbroken rhythm of Liam's heart. Liam's mind, however, was screaming, "Think about the future? I'm right here." Then came the words that would become the cornerstone of his new, terrible reality. They were spoken by his wife, the woman he had loved, the woman who had laid her head on his chest 1,000 nights and spoken of their shared dreams. Her voice was no longer performing grief. It was a low, conspiratorial hiss, a serpent's whisper in the sterile air. "His portfolio is modest, but the house is paid off. The firm has some value, I suppose." She sighed, a sound of avarice, not sorrow. "It's not what we're used to, but it's a start. Once it's all consolidated, finally, his money is mine." The monitor beside the bed did not register the cataclysm that had just occurred inside Liam's skull. The beep remained steady, unwavering, but in the silent, screaming cathedral of his mind, a world had just ended. Finally, the word was a hammer blow. This wasn't a new thought for her. This was the fulfillment of a long-held wish. He wasn't a husband she was losing. He was an investment that was finally maturing. Richard's voice was smoother, a layer of honey over pure greed. "Exactly, darling. It's what he would have wanted, for you to be secure. We'll get our lawyer, Stephen, to look at the power of attorney tomorrow. We need to move quickly before the hospital starts running up bills that eat into the principal." They didn't know he could hear them. They looked at his still form and saw an ending. They saw a balance sheet. They saw a problem to be managed and ultimately liquidated. What they didn't see was the architect, the man who built things, the man who understood that before you can build, you must have a blueprint. And in the cold, clear, silent fury of his locked-in mind, Liam Archer began to draw. Have you ever put your heart and soul into something, only to have it completely misunderstood or undervalued by the people who are supposed to be closest to you? It's a feeling of invisible betrayal that can cut deeper than any overt insult. If you've ever felt that way, or if you're just ready to see what happens when the underestimated finally get their due, please give this story a like and subscribe to the channel. We're all about stories where the quiet ones finally get to speak their truth. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Now let's get back to Liam and the blueprint he's starting to design. The life Liam had shared with Clara was, from the outside, a portrait of modern success. He, the talented and respected architect, known for his clean lines and human-centric designs. She, the beautiful daughter of the wealthy Preston family, a woman who brought an air of old money elegance to his self-made world. Their house, a minimalist masterpiece of glass and cedar that Liam had designed himself, was featured in magazines. They hosted dinner parties where the wine was expensive and the conversation was clever. But beneath the polished surface, a quiet corrosion had been at work for years. The Prestons had never truly accepted him. To them, he was a tradesman, albeit a well-paid one. Richard, whose own inherited fortune had been slowly dwindling for 2 decades due to a series of disastrous investments, spoke of Liam's profession with a tone of amused patronage. "It's wonderful that you build things with your hands, my boy," he'd once said, clapping Liam on the shoulder at a family Christmas gathering. A noble, simple calling. He'd said it while standing in the grand foyer of the house Liam had not only designed, but had largely paid for. Liam's firm, Archer Designs, was successful. It was his passion, his art. He created spaces that were more than just structures. They were homes, communities, places where life could unfold beautifully. He had a team of 10 dedicated architects who revered him. He made a very good living. But in the Preston family's universe, where wealth was measured not in millions, but in generations, he was middle class, a provider, a stable, boring foundation upon which Clara could build a life of leisurely lunches and charity galas. He had seen the signs, of course. The way Clara's eyes would glaze over when he tried to share the excitement of a new project, a challenging design problem he'd solved, her casual disdain for his practical car. "It's just so sensible, Liam. Don't you want something with a little more presence?" Her brother Mark, a man in his 30s who had never held a job for more than 6 months, would openly mock Liam's work ethic. "All work and no play, eh, Liam? You should learn to live a little. Dad, pass the port." Liam had tolerated it. He had tolerated it because he loved Clara, or at least the woman he believed her to be. He saw her as a victim of her upbringing, a bird in a gilded cage, and he believed his steady, grounded love could eventually free her. He thought her desire for luxury was a superficial layer, not the core of her being. He had been a fool, a patient, loving, hard-working fool. Lying in the hospital bed, the memory of their last anniversary dinner surfaced with painful clarity. He had presented her with a gift, a set of preliminary sketches for a small, free health clinic he planned to design and fund in an underserved neighborhood. It was a project he was deeply passionate about, the culmination of a lifelong dream to use his skills for public good. She had looked at the beautiful, intricate drawings, her smile tight. "Oh, Liam, that's very noble." She'd placed the drawings on the table, next to the breadbasket, as if they were a discarded napkin. Later that night, he'd overheard her on the phone with her mother. "He wants to build a clinic for the poor. Can you imagine? All that time and money, and for what? There's no return on that." "There's no return on that." The words echoed now, harmonizing with her whisper from moments before. "Finally, his money is mine." It was all the same song, a song of a hollow woman and her hollow family, a song he had been too deaf with love to truly hear. Until now. Now, in the roaring silence, he heard every note, and he knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the steel frame of a skyscraper, that he would not be the foundation for their shallow lives a moment longer. The demolition would be silent, precise, and absolute. The days that followed bled into one another, a gray watercolor of indignity. The Prestons, now emboldened, became the self-appointed arbiters of Liam's existence. They moved with an air of proprietary grief, their sorrow a performance for the benefit of the hospital staff. But when they were alone with him, the masks came off. His hospital room became their conference room. Richard, with a Mont Blanc pen and a leather-bound notebook, would sit in the visitor's chair, feet propped up on the edge of Liam's bed, and outline his plans. "First, we liquidate the stock portfolio," he'd say to Clara, his voice a low, business-like hum. "It's mostly blue-chip, boring stuff, too conservative. We can move that capital into something with a bit more dynamism. I've been looking at a new crypto venture." Liam, whose investment strategy was deliberately conservative, designed for long-term stable growth, felt a surge of cold rage. Richard's last dynamic venture had been a line of artisanal, gluten-free dog biscuits that had cost him $500,000. Mark, Clara's brother, was more interested in the tangible assets. He downloaded a real estate app on his phone and would swipe through pictures of sports cars. "You know, Clara, Liam's car is a disgrace. Once we get access to the accounts, the first thing we do is get you a proper vehicle. A Range Rover, maybe. Something that says Preston, not accountant." He'd say this while glancing at Liam's still face, a smirk playing on his lips, as if daring him to object. Clara, the grieving wife, played her part with chilling precision. To the doctors, she was a fountain of concerned questions. "Is he in any pain? Are you sure you're doing everything you can?" But the questions were always framed around permanence. She wasn't asking about recovery, she was fishing for a death sentence. She wanted the official stamp of hopelessness that would unlock her future. One afternoon, a new doctor came in, Dr. Anya Sharma, a neurologist with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She performed a series of tests, checking his reflexes, shining a light into his unblinking eyes. The Prestons hovered in the doorway. "Well, doctor?" Richard asked, his tone impatient. "Any change?" Dr. Sharma's gaze lingered on Liam's face for a moment longer than the others. "His pupillary response is normal. Brainstem reflexes are intact. It's unusual." She turned to Clara. "Has he shown any sign of response at all? A flicker? An eye movement?" "Nothing," Clara said, her voice catching theatrically. "He's just gone." But as Dr. Sharma leaned in close, shining the penlight, Liam focused every ounce of his will, every fiber of his being, on a single command. "Look at her. Look at her." He tried to shift his gaze from the ceiling to her face. It was like trying to push a mountain. His eyes didn't move. But in the maelstrom of his mind, he felt a spark, a connection, a twitch. Dr. Sharma straightened up, a thoughtful frown on her face. "I see." She didn't sound convinced. Her eyes met Liam's for a second, and in that brief moment he felt a flicker of something other than despair. He felt seen. It was a sliver of hope in an ocean of darkness. Later that day, Clara came in alone. She was carrying a briefcase. Liam recognized it as his own. She sat down and opened it, pulling out files and documents. It was the portfolio for his architectural firm. "Okay, Liam," she said, her voice devoid of its usual soft tones. It was crisp, businesslike. "Let's see what we're working with." She spread the papers across the small, rolling bedside table. "Archer Designs, profit and loss statements, employee contracts." She scoffed. "God, it's all so small. 10 employees. You pay your lead designer $150,000 a year? That's absurd. We can cut that." She was dismantling his life's work in front of him, reducing his passion, his art, the livelihoods of people who depended on him, to numbers on a page to be slashed. He watched her, this stranger wearing his wife's face, and the pain was so sharp, so acute, it was almost physical. He cataloged the insult. He filed it away in the cold, clear archive of his memory, next to the memory of her whisper, next to the memory of her father's cologne. On the far side of the table, pushed aside to make room for the files, lay his pen. It wasn't a Mont Blanc like Richard's. It was a custom-designed object, sleek in matte black, a perfect cylinder of anodized aluminum. He had designed it himself, a beautiful, functional tool. It was his favorite. He had been holding it the moment the stroke hit. It had clattered to the floor with him. Someone, a paramedic probably, had placed it here on the table with his other personal effects. The Prestons saw a pen, a simple writing instrument. Liam saw a key. Inside the pen's casing, almost impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look, was a micro SD card. It was a key he had designed years ago, a failsafe. On that card were the encrypted credentials, the private keys, the legal directives that connected Liam Archer, humble architect, to his real work, to his real life, to his real fortune. He stared at the pen, the one object in the room that told the truth. It was a promise, a weapon, a dormant giant. All he had to do was find a way to wake it up. And as Clara continued to prune the branches of his life, unaware of the forest she was standing in, Liam focused on the pen and began, once again, to draw his plans. The transition from the hospital to his own home was not the comfort it should have been. It was a strategic retreat by the Prestons, a maneuver to bring the asset fully under their control. The official narrative, spun by Clara with tearful grace, was that she wanted Liam to be in familiar surroundings, to give him every possible chance at a sensory-triggered recovery. The reality was that his house, the masterpiece of glass and cedar he had poured his soul into, was about to become his cage. They hired a single, overworked home care nurse for the daytime shift. At night, he was their problem. They installed the hospital bed in the center of the great room, the soaring, double-height space that was the heart of the home. It was a cruel irony. He was now the centerpiece, the captive king on a medical-grade throne, forced to watch as his kingdom was dismantled. Richard and Mark were there almost every day. They no longer bothered with the pretense of mourning. The house was now their clubhouse, and Liam's silent presence was part of the furniture. "The acoustics in here are terrible," Richard announced one afternoon, clapping his hands together and listening to the echo. "All this glass and hard surfaces. When we sell, the new owners will probably want to gut it. Too cold, too impersonal." He said this while looking directly at Liam, a glint of malicious pleasure in his eyes. Liam, who had spent months calculating the precise angles of the cedar slats on the ceiling to optimize sound diffusion, who had chosen the specific density of the wool rugs to absorb ambient noise, felt a familiar cold fury. He had created a space of serene, balanced acoustics. Richard, with his tin ear and bankrupt soul, could only hear the echo of his own emptiness. Mark, meanwhile, was conducting his own inventory. He would walk through the house, picking up objects Liam had curated over a lifetime. A piece of reclaimed timber from a 19th century bridge, a hand-thrown ceramic vase from a trip to Japan, a first edition of a book on urban planning. He'd examine them with a pawnbroker's eye. "This stuff is probably worth something," he'd muse to Clara. "We should get it all appraised. An estate sale could be a nice little cash injection." Clara, for her part, was settling into her role as the lady of the manor. She started wearing his shirts, not in a sentimental, "I miss my husband" way. She wore his expensive, custom-tailored dress shirts as smocks while she repotted plants, the cuffs dragging in the dirt. It was an act of erasure. She wasn't just taking over his life, she was actively overwriting it, smudging the ink before it was even dry. The deepest humiliation came one evening. Clara had friends over, 2 other women from her social circle. They sat on the expensive sofa, drinking wine, their laughter sharp and brittle in the quiet house. Liam was parked in his wheelchair in the corner, a throw blanket over his legs, positioned like a forgotten piece of luggage. "You are being so brave, Clara," one of the women said. "I don't know how I would cope." "You just do," Clara said, taking a sip of her wine. "You find a strength you didn't know you had." She glanced over at Liam. "The doctors say it's for the best, really. He's not in any pain. He's not there. It's just a body." Just a body. The words hung in the air. Liam wanted to scream, to thrash, to launch himself out of the chair and show them the furious, vibrant life that was burning inside him. But he could do nothing. He could only sit and listen and remember. But in the long, silent hours of the night, when the house was finally quiet, Liam worked. His first goal was communication. He remembered Dr. Sharma's question, a flicker, an eye movement. He started with his finger. Lying in the bed, under the sheets, he would focus his entire consciousness on his right index finger. He would imagine the neural pathway, the electrical signal traveling from his brain, down his spine, along his arm, to his fingertip. Move, move, move. For days, nothing. It was like shouting into a void. But he was an architect. He understood that the most massive structures are built one small, precise component at a time. He didn't give up. One night, after hours of intense concentration, he felt it. A tremor. A tiny, infinitesimal twitch in the muscle of his forearm. It wasn't the finger, but it was close. It was a signal. The line wasn't dead. There was a flicker of electricity. Hope, fierce and sharp, surged through him. He began to practice relentlessly. During the day, while the Prestons schemed and Clara paraded his possessions, he would lie perfectly still. But at night, he was an athlete in training. He worked on the twitch, honing it, trying to gain control. From the forearm, he moved to the hand, then, finally, to the finger. After a week of torturous effort, he could produce a deliberate, if spastic, twitch in his right index finger. His second line of attack was Dr. Sharma. She was scheduled for a follow-up visit. The Prestons saw it as a formality, another box to tick on the road to power of attorney. Liam saw it as his only lifeline. He spent the days leading up to her visit practicing a new skill, blinking. One blink for no, two blinks for yes. It was exhausting. The muscles of his eyelids, so used to their autonomous function, resisted his conscious control. But he pushed, driven by a will that had been forged in the fire of their contempt. The day Dr. Sharma was due to arrive, he felt a sliver of something he hadn't felt in weeks. Anticipation. He was a prisoner, planning his escape. The plan was fragile, full of risk. But it was a plan, and it was his. The day of the legal meeting was staged with all the pompous solemnity Richard Preston could muster. He had insisted they use the formal dining room. The long mahogany table, a wedding gift from his own parents to Liam and Clara, gleamed under the recessed lighting. Liam was positioned at the head of the table, in his specialized wheelchair. He was an effigy at his own wake. Richard sat at the opposite end, looking regal and important. Clara sat to Liam's right, looking pale and appropriately somber. Mark lounged in a corner, scrolling through his phone. The final player was Stephen Croft, Richard's lawyer, a man with a shiny suit and shifty eyes. He laid a sheaf of documents on the table with a soft, final thud. "All right," Croft began, clearing his throat. "As we've discussed, this is a straightforward application for durable power of attorney. Given Mr. Archer's condition, the court will quickly grant Clara, as his spouse, full legal authority over his financial and medical affairs." He slid a document and a pen towards Clara. "This is the final affidavit. It just needs your signature." Richard beamed. "Excellent, all very neat. Let's get this sorted so Clara can begin to put her life back in order." Her life. The phrase twisted in Liam's mind. Not their life. Not even a life of caring for him. A life to be put back in order, as if he were a mess to be cleaned up. Croft then produced another document. "And I have here a copy of Mr. Archer's last will and testament, which we retrieved from his home office safe. As expected, it's a simple spousal will. It names Clara Preston Archer as the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. No complications. A collective sigh of relief, subtle but palpable, went through the Prestons. Mark even looked up from his phone. "So that's it then?" he asked. "It's all Clara's?" Upon Mr. Archer's passing, yes, Croft confirmed. And with power of attorney, she can manage the assets in his best interest until that time. His best interest, of course, Richard said, a pious look on his face that didn't reach his eyes. Liam listened to them discussing the spoils of his life, his death, as if he were a particularly interesting piece of taxidermy. They were so confident, so arrogant. They had the will, they had the lawyer, they had the incapacitated victim. They thought they had won. What they didn't know was that Dr. Sharma's visit the previous week had been a quiet triumph. While Clara was distracted by a phone call in the other room, the doctor had knelt by his wheelchair. "Liam," she'd said, her voice low and urgent, "I believe you can hear me. I need you to try something. Can you blink twice if you understand me?" It was the moment he had trained for. With a monumental effort that left him feeling drained, he forced his eyelids to close and open, close and open. Two distinct, deliberate blinks. Dr. Sharma's sharp intake of breath was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're in there." He had spent the next 10 minutes in a frantic, exhausting, silent conversation. "Are you aware of your family's actions?" Two blinks. "Yes." "Are they trying to take control of your assets?" Two blinks. "Yes." "Are you in danger?" He paused. He considered. One slow blink. "No, not danger. This was a war." "Do you have a way to fight back? A person I can contact?" Two blinks. "Yes." She had pulled out her phone. "Give me a name. I will go through the alphabet. Blink twice at the right letter." It had taken an agonizingly long time. E, V, E, L, Y, N, R, E, E, D. And then a phone number, digit by agonizing digit. By the end, sweat he couldn't feel was pouring down his face, in his mind. But he had done it. He had passed the message. Dr. Sharma had squeezed his inert hand. "I will make the call, Liam. Hold on. Just hold on." Now, as Clara picked up the pen to sign away his life, Liam held on. He stared at the polished surface of the table, reflecting the smug faces of his tormentors. He felt the familiar quiet before the storm, the deep, calm breath before the plunge. The architect in him appreciated the symmetry of it all. They were about to sign a document in a room he designed, at a table they gave him, to steal a life he had built. It was a perfect, self-contained tragedy, and it was all about to be demolished. Clara picked up the pen. It was a cheap plastic pen provided by the lawyer, not the elegant instrument Richard favored. Its nib hovered over the signature line of the affidavit. The document would grant her total control. It was the finish line, the culmination of weeks of patient, ghoulish waiting. Richard leaned forward, a proud smile on his face, as if watching his daughter graduate. "Go on, darling. Let's get this over with." The air in the room was thick with anticipation. Mark had finally put his phone away and was watching, a greedy light in his eyes. This was the moment the keys to the kingdom were officially handed over. And then the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, clear, and utterly incongruous. It sliced through the self-congratulatory atmosphere like a shard of glass. Clara flinched, startled. She put the pen down, leaving a small blot of ink on the paper. "Who on earth could that be?" she asked, her voice tight with irritation. "I told everyone we weren't to be disturbed." Richard scowled. "Mark, go and see who it is. Tell them to go away." Mark grumbled but shuffled out of the dining room. They could hear his footsteps in the hall, the sound of the heavy front door opening, and then a confused, muffled exchange of voices. A moment later, Mark reappeared in the doorway. his usual lazy posture replaced with a ramrod's stiffness. He looked flustered. Clara, Dad, there are some people here to see Liam." Before Richard could object, a woman stepped past Mark and into the room. She was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. She moved with an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. Her eyes, the color of cool slate, swept the room, taking in the scene, the table, the documents, the lawyer, the family, before landing on Liam. Her expression, which had been one of icy neutrality, softened for a fraction of a second. A flicker of concern, of respect, of recognition. She strode past the table, ignoring the stunned faces of Richard and Clara, and came to a stop beside Liam's wheelchair. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch firm and reassuring. "Liam," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the silence. "The Sentinel protocol has been activated. I'm here." The Prestons stared, mouths agape. Richard was the first to recover his bluster. He stood up, puffing out his chest. "I beg your pardon. Who are you? And what is this nonsense about a Sentinel protocol? This is a private family matter. You are trespassing." The woman turned to face him. Her gaze was so direct, so utterly unimpressed, that Richard took an involuntary step back. Behind her, two more figures had entered the room. One was a man in an equally sharp suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. The other was Dr. Anya Sharma. "My name is Evelyn Reed," the woman said, her voice dropping a few degrees, losing any trace of warmth it had held for Liam. "And you are Richard Preston. You are Clara Preston Archer. And you," she glanced at Mark, "are a waste of space." Mark's jaw dropped. Evelyn turned her attention back to Richard. "This is no longer a private family matter. It became a corporate matter the moment you attempted to fraudulently seize control of the assets of my company's founder and majority shareholder." A stunned silence fell over the room. Croft, the lawyer, looked utterly bewildered. Clara stared at Evelyn, her face a mask of confusion and fury. "Your company?" Clara spat, finding her voice. "Liam doesn't own a company. He's an architect. He has a small firm, that's all." She laughed, a brittle, unconvincing sound. "You've clearly made some kind of mistake." Evelyn's smile was a terrifying thing. It was thin, sharp, and held no humor whatsoever. "No, Mrs. Archer, you've made the mistake. You thought your husband was a simple architect, a humble provider. You looked at a titan and saw a footstool." She took a step towards the center of the room, her presence dominating the space. "Liam Archer is the founder, the chief technology architect, and the silent 85% majority shareholder of a company called Aegis Innovations." The name landed in the room with no initial impact. Richard frowned. "Aegis what? Never heard of it." Evelyn's terrifying smile widened. "I'm not surprised. We don't advertise. We're a privately held green technology and materials science firm. We develop and license proprietary carbon capture systems, next-generation battery storage, and sustainable building materials to governments and Fortune 50 companies." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Your husband's modest life as an architect was his passion, his hobby. It was also the perfect cover. Nobody looks twice at an architect. They don't expect him to be sitting on a personal net worth tied to a corporate valuation that, as of our last round of funding, was $17 billion. The quiet bomb. It didn't explode. It simply detonated the very air in the room, sucking all the sound, all the breath, all the arrogance out of it. $17 billion. The number just hung there, obscene and incomprehensible. Richard Preston, the man who judged others by their bank balances, slowly, deliberately sank back into his chair. His face, moments before florid with indignation, had turned the color of old parchment. The Mont Blanc pen he'd been fiddling with slipped from his numb fingers, and clattered onto the mahogany table. Mark was staring at Liam, his mouth hanging open, a cartoon of disbelief. The sports cars he'd been dreaming of were suddenly not just possible, but laughably insignificant. But all eyes, including Evelyn's, were on Clara. Her face had gone completely white, a canvas of pure shock. The blood had drained from it, leaving her skin looking translucent and fragile. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on Liam. Not on Evelyn, not on the lawyer, but on the still, silent figure in the wheelchair she had been so ready to discard. The man in the sharp suit stepped forward, opening his briefcase on the table with a decisive snap. "My name is Julian Davison," he said, his voice as crisp as a new banknote. "I am Mr. Archer's actual legal counsel. The will you have there," he gestured dismissively at the document on the table, "is a decoy, a simple boilerplate document Liam created years ago for this very eventuality. His real estate is managed by a complex series of trusts, the details of which are held by my office." He looked directly at Stephen Croft, who seemed to be shrinking in his shiny suit. "As for the Sentinel Protocol, it is a legally binding directive, lodged with my firm and the Board of Aegis. It is activated under specific, verifiable circumstances, namely if Mr. Archer is medically incapacitated and non-responsive for a period exceeding 30 days. The protocol triggers an immediate and total freeze on all personal assets. It transfers temporary executive authority for Aegis Innovations to the CEO, Ms. Reed, and it mandates a full neurological evaluation by a panel of independent specialists to determine Mr. Archer's true cognitive state." As if on cue, Dr. Sharma stepped forward. "I am Dr. Anya Sharma, one of those specialists. I am here to conduct the first part of that evaluation, and based on my previous examination, it is my strong professional opinion that Mr. Archer is not in a vegetative state. I believe he is suffering from locked-in syndrome and is fully, cognitively aware of everything that has been happening around him." The final piece clicked into place. The full, horrifying scope of the situation descended upon the Prestons. Not only was Liam unimaginably wealthy, but he had heard everything, every whisper, every insult, every greedy calculation. The silence that followed was a universe away from the quiet of the hospital room. This was a silence born of pure, unadulterated horror. Clara was the first to break. It wasn't a shout or a scream. It was a choked, desperate sound, a gasp for air in a world that had suddenly been deprived of it. She scrambled from her chair, stumbling around the table, her earlier poise completely shattered. She fell to her knees beside Liam's wheelchair, grabbing his inert, lifeless hand. Her touch, which he had once craved, now felt like a brand. "Liam?" Her voice was a ragged plea, a desperate attempt to rewind time. "Liam, darling, can you hear me? Is this true? Is this all true?" Her eyes darted from his blank face to Evelyn's cold one, and back again. "A joke? Is this some kind of cruel joke?" Liam, the silent observer, the ghost in the machine, knew this was his moment. Not a moment for grand gestures, but for a small, devastating truth. He gathered every ounce of his will, every particle of the fury and betrayal that had been his constant companions for weeks. He focused it all on the muscles in his neck, the ones that had refused to obey him for so long. He couldn't speak, he couldn't gesture, but he could move. Slowly, with the grinding effort of a tectonic plate shifting, he turned his head. Just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. He turned his face away from his kneeling, pleading wife, away from her touch, away from her voice. It was a rejection more absolute, more final, than any words could ever be. Clara's hand fell away from his, as if his skin had turned to fire. The small, silent movement had screamed a novel of contempt. Julian Davison, Liam's real lawyer, seemed not to notice the personal drama unfolding. He was all business. He pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the table in front of Richard. "Mr. Preston," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This is a notice to vacate. This property," he gestured around the magnificent room, "is not and has never been in Liam Archer's name. It is owned by a holding company, Cedar Ridge Properties, LLC, which is a fully owned subsidiary of the Aegis Group. As you are not employees of Aegis, and your presence here is no longer sanctioned by its owner, you are required to leave the premises immediately." He produced two more smaller envelopes. "This one is for you, Clara. It is a formal notification that all joint credit cards, bank accounts, and lines of credit have been frozen, pending a full audit and investigation into potential conspiracy to defraud a vulnerable individual. The car you are driving is leased through an Aegis corporate account, the keys to which will be collected by my associate at the door." He slid the last envelope towards Mark. "And for you, Mr. Preston, the stipend you have been receiving from your sister, drawn from her joint account with Liam, has been terminated, effective immediately. The edifice of their lives, built on Liam's misunderstood foundation, had just been condemned. They weren't just being cut off, they were being evicted, not from a life of luxury, but from the very stage on which they had been performing." Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice a weak, reedy version of its former boom. "This is his home. This is his family." Evelyn Reed, who had been watching silently, finally spoke. "He has a home," she said, her voice like chipping ice. "We are taking him to it now. And as for his family, I think we've established who that is." She nodded to two large, discreet men who had entered with her and had been standing silently by the door. They were dressed as paramedics. "Gentlemen, let's get Mr. Archer ready to go." The chaos that followed was pathetic. Richard blustered about his rights, his voice cracking. Mark, for once, was speechless, his face a pallid shade of green. He seemed to be mentally calculating how many bus tickets his last $20 bill would buy. Clara remained on the floor, a broken doll in a designer dress. Her world hadn't just been turned upside down, it had been revealed as a complete fiction. She wasn't the long-suffering wife of a modest architect. She wasn't the soon-to-be wealthy widow. She was nothing. A footnote in a story she had never even known how to read. The paramedics were efficient and gentle, moving around Liam with a quiet professionalism that was a world away from the grudging care of the Prestons. They checked his vitals, speaking to him as if he could understand, because they knew he could. As they prepared to move his wheelchair, Clara looked up, her face streaked with tears, a desperate, wild hope in her eyes. "Wait," she pleaded, her voice hoarse. "Take me with you. Liam, please, let me come with you. I can help. I can take care of you. I love you." Liam, from his silent prison, felt a profound, weary sadness. "You love my money," he thought. "You have never even met me." Evelyn Reed stepped between them, a human shield of cool competence. "That won't be possible, Mrs. Archer," she said, her tone final. "Mr. Archer will be receiving the best care in the world. Your services will not be required." She paused, then delivered the final, crushing blow. "In fact, Mr. Davison has also prepared a restraining order. You are to remain at least 500 feet away from Liam, his residences, and his places of business. Any attempt to make contact will be met with immediate legal action." The last thread of hope snapped. Clara crumpled, the sound of her sobbing a desolate counterpoint to the quiet efficiency of Liam's departure. As the paramedics wheeled him out of the dining room, past the wreckage of the Prestons' lives, he didn't look back. He was an architect, after all. He was already focused on the new structure he was going to build. The weeks that followed the great revelation were a study in contrasts. For Liam, it was the beginning of a slow, arduous, but profoundly hopeful reconstruction. For the Prestons, it was a rapid, brutal demolition. Liam was transported not to a hospital, but to a private, state-of-the-art medical facility disguised as a serene country estate in upstate New York. It was a facility funded by Aegis, designed for the exclusive use of its top-tier employees. Here, the world's leading neurologists, physical therapists, and speech pathologists descended upon him. They were armed not with Clara's desperate hope for a permanent diagnosis, but with Evelyn's unwavering belief in his potential for recovery. The work was grueling. His days were a meticulously scheduled regimen of therapies. There were hours spent with a speech pathologist, relearning the connection between thought and sound, starting with guttural noises and graduating to single, hard-won words. His first word after a month of intense effort was not Clara or help. It was Evelyn. Acknowledgement. Gratitude. There were punishing sessions of physical therapy where attendants would move his limbs in passive exercises, fighting against the atrophy, reminding his muscles of their purpose. And all the while his mind, his greatest asset, was working. Evelyn had set up a system for him, a sophisticated eye-tracking technology that allowed him to control a cursor on a screen. He could finally communicate. He could type. His first long message, painstakingly typed out over the course of an afternoon, was to the Board of Aegis Innovations. It was a calm, clear, and authoritative statement, assuring them of his cognitive soundness and outlining a temporary command structure. It quelled any internal fears and consolidated Evelyn's power. He was not just a patient, he was a CEO working remotely. Meanwhile, the Preston family was discovering the law of gravity. Their fall was as swift as it was public. Richard, stripped of the reflected glory of Liam's home and wealth, was exposed for what he was, a pompous old man with bad judgment. His business contacts, who had tolerated him for the chance to be near what they perceived as real money, now crossed the street to avoid him. The story, leaked by an unknown source, Julian Davison was far too professional to be suspected, became a minor sensation in the city's financial circles. The story of the old money fool who tried to swindle his secret billionaire son-in-law. Mark's fall was less dramatic but more pathetic. With his allowance cut off and his sister's couch no longer an option, he was forced to get a job. He ended up as a valet at a high-end restaurant, the very kind of establishment he used to frequent. There was a certain poetic justice in him now parking the Range Rovers he had once dreamed of owning. Clara's fate was the most complex. She was adrift. The restraining order was absolute, and Julian Davison's office was an impenetrable fortress. She tried to hire her own lawyers, but she had no money. The small amount in her personal savings account was quickly exhausted. She tried appealing to the press, attempting to spin a tale of a grieving wife being kept from her helpless husband by a predatory corporation. But Aegis's PR department, directed by Liam himself via his eye-tracking computer, was ready. They released a carefully curated set of facts, the testimony of the home care nurse Liam's team had hired, detailing the Prestons' conversations, the affidavit Clara had been about to sign, a statement from Dr. Sharma about Clara's insistence on a vegetative diagnosis. The media narrative quickly shifted. Clara was no longer the victim. She was a villain, a modern-day Lady Macbeth. She ended up living in a small, furnished apartment, paid for by a dwindling trust fund her mother had left her. Her society friends, who had once flocked to her side to offer brave condolences, now ghosted her calls. In their world, being poor was a tragedy. Being exposed as a grasping fool was a contagious disease. 6 months after the confrontation, Liam was ready. He had been working relentlessly. He could now speak, his voice slow and deliberate, but clear. He had regained partial control of his hands and could sit upright in his wheelchair without support. The day was coming when he would walk again. But first, there was one piece of old business to attend to. He agreed to a supervised meeting with Clara. It was not an act of forgiveness, nor was it an act of cruelty. It was, in his architect's mind, a necessary step in deconstruction. You have to survey the old damaged structure before you can clear the site for something new. The meeting took place in a neutral, sterile room at the facility. Clara was shown in by a nurse. She had lost weight. The expensive clothes she wore hung on her slightly, and the confident gloss she'd always carried had been replaced by a brittle, nervous energy. Liam sat in his wheelchair, dressed in a simple sweater and trousers. He looked calm, centered. He did not look like a victim. He looked like a man in charge of his own recovery. "Liam," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "you look, well." "I am getting stronger every day," he replied, his voice measured. Each word was a testament to his will. She took a hesitant step forward. I am so sorry, Liam. I don't know what I was thinking. My father, he gets these ideas." Liam held up a hand, a gesture that was now slow but controlled. "Stop, Clara." She fell silent. He looked at her, his gaze not angry, but analytical. He was an architect examining a flawed design. "This isn't about your father. This is about you. I need you to understand what you did. Not what you almost did. What you did." He began to speak, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. It was his list of grievances, the moral mirror he had been polishing for months. "On the 14th of April, in my hospital room, you told your father you were going to consolidate my assets because, quote, finally his money is mine. You did not say our money, you said mine." Clara flinched as if struck. "On the 17th of April, you sat by my bed and went through my firm's financials. You talked about firing my lead designer, a man who has worked with me for 12 years, to cut costs. On the 22nd of April, you had friends over. You drank my wine in my house, and you told them I was just a body. You stood 10 feet away from me and erased my humanity. And on the 2nd of May, you picked up a pen to sign a document that would have declared me legally dead in every way that mattered, so you could begin to, as your father put it, put your life back in order." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Each statement was an irrefutable fact, a brick in the wall that now stood between them. "You didn't mourn a husband, Clara. You were preparing to probate an estate. The only thing you miscalculated was the decimal point." Tears were streaming down her face now, silent and useless. "I loved you," she whispered. Liam's expression didn't change. "No," he said, his voice soft but devastating. "You loved the idea of being my wife. You loved the house, the status, the security. You never for one moment saw me, the real me." He gestured to himself, to the wheelchair, to the slow, deliberate way he held himself. "This is the real me, a man who builds things, a man who fights, a man who was trapped in the dark and found his own way out. You were never married to that man. You wouldn't have known what to do with him." He took a deep breath. The confrontation was exhausting him, but he needed to finish it. "This is the last time we will see each other. Julian will be in touch about the divorce. It will be quick and final." He turned his wheelchair and, with a push of a button, began to roll towards the door. "Liam, wait!" she cried out, a raw, desperate sound. "What am I supposed to do?" He stopped at the door and turned his head. He looked at her one last time, this woman who had been the center of his world and had become a stranger. He gave her the only truth he had left. "I don't know, Clara," he said. "For the first time in your life, you're going to have to design your own future. I suggest you start with a better foundation." The door closed behind him, leaving her alone in the sterile room with the wreckage of her choices. The divorce was, as Liam had promised, quick and final. Clara, on the advice of her increasingly desperate lawyer, did not contest it. The evidence against her was too overwhelming, the power of the Aegis legal team too absolute. The question of the settlement, however, was a source of much speculation. The tabloids, which had picked up on the story, ran breathless headlines. "Will spurned billionaire leave scheming wife penniless?" Liam's decision when it came was as precise and unexpected as one of his designs. He did not leave her destitute. He did not force her into poverty as a form of punishment. That would have been petty, and Liam was not a petty man. Vengeance was a flawed design. It wasted energy and created unstable structures. He was interested in balance. Julian Davison met with Clara in his austere, intimidatingly quiet office. He presented her with the final settlement. It was a single, lump sum payment of $500,000. Clara stared at the number. It was a fortune to some, an insult to others. To her, it was baffling. "I don't understand," she said. Davison leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "It's quite simple, Mrs. Archer. Liam has instructed me to explain his reasoning. For 10 years, you lived a life you believe was funded by a moderately successful architect. You had a beautiful home, you drove a nice car, you took lovely vacations. You calculated the value of that life and you were dissatisfied." He leaned forward slightly. "This sum represents, with interest and a generous cost of living adjustment, the total net earnings of Archer Designs over the entire course of your marriage. It is the money you thought you were marrying. The money you whispered was finally yours. Liam felt it was only right that you should have it." The elegant cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't a punishment, it was a lesson in perspective. He was giving her exactly what she thought she deserved, and in doing so, highlighting the colossal gap between her ambition and her reality. "You wanted his money," Davison continued, his voice neutral, "but you never wanted him. This sum represents what you believed his life was worth. He wishes you well. You are free to go and build your own life with it." As for Richard and Mark, their consequences were more direct. An internal investigation by Aegis's formidable corporate security team uncovered evidence that Richard had attempted to use the falsified power of attorney to approach several banks for a line of credit against Liam's supposed assets. It was a clear case of attempted fraud. Aegis did not press criminal charges. Instead, they did something far more effective. They shared the findings of their investigation with the IRS and the State Banking Commission. The ensuing audits and investigations would tie Richard up in legal knots and financial ruin for the rest of his life. His downfall was not a dramatic explosion, but a slow, suffocating death by paperwork. Liam, meanwhile, was focused on building, not destroying. He had made a near-full recovery. The wheelchair was gone, replaced first by crutches, then by a single, elegant cane made of carbon fiber and polished maple. A gift from the Aegis R&D department. He was back at the helm of his company, not just as a silent founder, but as a visible, active leader. The story of his ordeal and recovery had, against his wishes, made him a public figure. He decided to use that platform. He had a final meeting with the two women who had become his unexpected allies. He met Evelyn Reed and Dr. Anya Sharma for dinner at a quiet restaurant. "I don't know how I can ever repay you both," he said, raising his glass. Evelyn smiled, a genuine smile this time, full of warmth. "You don't have to, Liam. You would have done the same for me. That's what the Sentinel Protocol was for. It was a pact." Dr. Sharma nodded. "I just did my job, Liam. I listened to my patient. The real one, not the family's version." Her sharp eyes twinkled. "Although I admit, calling that number was the most interesting thing I've done in my medical career." They talked for hours, not as a billionaire and his employees, but as three people bound by a strange and intense experience. They were his new foundation, strong, reliable, built on integrity. 1 year later, the autumn sun was warm on Liam's face. He stood on a raised platform, his cane resting lightly at his side, his posture straight and confident. He was at the groundbreaking ceremony for the new East Side Community Library, a beautiful, innovative structure of light, air, and recycled materials. It was a project he had personally designed, in which his old firm, Archer Designs, now thriving as a boutique subsidiary of the Aegis Group, was building. The entire project was being funded by the newly established Archer Foundation. It was the evolution of his dream, the free clinic he had once sketched for a wife who couldn't see its value. A crowd had gathered, city officials, community leaders, residents of the neighborhood. A bank of news cameras stood ready. He was no longer just an architect, he was a symbol. He stepped up to the podium, the plans for the library visible on an easel behind him. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice strong and clear, carrying across the crowd. "When we design a building, we start with the foundation. The foundation has to be strong, it has to be true, because everything else, every wall, every window, every beam, rests upon it. If the foundation is flawed, the most beautiful facade will eventually crack and crumble." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience, but also looking inward. "I've learned a lot about foundations in the last couple of years. I learned that the foundations of a life aren't made of money or status or appearance. They are made of stronger stuff: integrity, resilience, kindness, and truth. This library," he said, gesturing to the plans, "is a building, but it's also an idea. It's the idea that everyone deserves access to a strong foundation, a place to learn, to grow, to dream, and to build a life of their own design." His speech was met with thunderous applause. Later, as the press swarmed him, he answered their questions with grace and patience. He didn't speak of his ex-wife or her family. He didn't speak of betrayal. He spoke of second chances. He spoke of the future. The final scene of that long, dramatic chapter of his life was a quiet one. That evening, he sat on the terrace of his new home, a smaller, more intimate space he designed, nestled in the hills overlooking the city lights. He was not alone. Evelyn Reed sat across from him, a comfortable silence between them as they watched the sky turn from violet to indigo. He was sketching in a notebook, his hand moving with the old, familiar confidence. It was not a blueprint for a skyscraper or a corporate headquarters. It was a simple design for a park bench. He had not just survived. He had not just gotten revenge. He had transcended the entire sordid affair. He had taken the rubble of his old life and used it as the aggregate for a new, stronger foundation. He had lost a wife, a family, and an illusion, but he had found himself. And in the quiet hum of the city below, Liam Archer, the architect of his own second act, was finally, truly, at peace. What an incredible journey of resilience and vindication. Liam's story is a powerful reminder that our true worth is not determined by how others see us, but by the integrity and strength we build within ourselves. It teaches us that the most formidable structures are built on a foundation of character, not cash. What part of Liam's story resonated with you the most? Have you ever had a moment where you had to be your own hero, to fight back from a place where you felt powerless? Share your thoughts and your own stories of strength in the comments below. Your story could be the blueprint that inspires someone else to start building again. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. If you found this story of justice and redemption satisfying, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales that uplift, empower, and inspire. We believe in the power of stories to change lives, and we're so grateful to have you as part of our community. Until next time, remember to build your life with purpose and on a foundation of truth.